Good afternoon. My name is Ian Dieters. I hold a PhD in theoretical mathematics. I'm also an associate of the Casualty Actuarial Society. The intention of this video is to help accurately calibrate, to the extent that I am able, the threat of COVID-19 as well as how one should act. I do not presume I am correct and welcome correction and discussion. In particular, I'm not looking to die just yet, nor contribute to the demise of others. It should also be mentioned at the outset that I am not an epidemiologist, but I have worked in the area of predictive analytics and data science for 7.5 years, and I am not afraid of COVID-19. Now, perhaps I am in error, but this is always true. Briefly, I'm not afraid of COVID-19 because I have not heard people say things that I would not also expect them to say in a far more innocuous situation. And while this may sound strange given the massive business shutdowns by various state governors, I maintain that even this could have been expected. In all this, my intention is not to disparage any particular person, but rather to present my estimation of the incentive structures facing all interested parties. For example, I do not regard politicians, as a vocation, as either corrupt or altruistic. Rather, I presume that they, like anyone, are operating according to a value hierarchy and constraints on the resources. In all this, I will not be commenting on epidemiological research. Rather, I will be commenting on the structures used to acquire and use such research. And here are my reasons for a lack of fear. 1. The structural incentive for a politician is to be re-elected, and this would imply that it is almost always better to overestimate a threat. If a threat is overestimated and stringent measures, whose costs are borne incrementally and later are enacted, then the threat is neutralized, and the cost is not largely associated with the politician. However, if the politician underestimates a threat, then the population suffers, and that suffering will be assigned to the politician. Hence, overestimation is always a good political strategy. Moreover, under the cover of protecting the population, the politician can also pass legislation which serves to increase the politician's power, which is another incentive of the politician. For instance, in the midst of this crisis, thank the gods that someone is looking out for the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, as can be seen in H.R. 748-272. Moreover, by forcibly shutting down business and then extending cash payments to the citizens, the net is to increase the wards of the state, which also increases a politician's power. 2. Any student of the media knows that if it bleeds, it leads. Hence, one would suppose that any story of tragedy would be emphasized. Any story which would heighten fear would find its way to the forefront of the teleprompter or the front page. The fact of the matter is that discussions of the myriad of incentives and constraints facing individuals en masse are not interesting in 30-second sound bites, the format the media seemingly and insultingly thinks the average citizen can handle. Hence, the emphasis of the media on death as opposed to an enumeration of the values that each person holds and a constrained optimization designed to achieve them is not surprising. The media is responding to their incentives. One must also consider the incentives of the experts making proclamations. One of my laws is that trust is earned incrementally. I do not give my checking account and routing number to anyone who seems like a nice guy. Similarly, I give more weight to a person's words if that person has to bear the consequence of being wrong. And typically, experts do not have to bear the consequence of being incorrect. In particular, if an expert, defined in relative terms as someone you presume to have more knowledge than you in some area of expertise, does not bear the cost of being wrong in a proclamation, then they have a decreased incentive for precision. I have personal experience with this. Because I have a PhD in math, I spent a fair amount of time in the academy. And in the academy, mistakes are not typically costly. Someone observes your mistake in a paper or programming code. You thank them for their trouble, and then you correct it. When I took this attitude with me into the private sector, I received quite a few verbal thrashings. The reason was simply that if I turned in an analysis with a minor error, that is to say, simple in its remedy, but costly in its impact, the company could lose a great deal of money. Hence, over time, I recognized that I needed to not only do the analysis, but also determine some way to figure out if the analysis was done correctly. And of course, this is at the heart of the scientific method. The scientific method is, essentially, an intellectual mechanism of negation. One declares a series of tests to which one will subject one's hypotheses to determine if one is wrong. In general, this is why businesses are initially loath to adopt the model of an analyst. The analyst does not directly bear the consequences of being wrong. The management who accepts the analyst's model and who is held accountable for profit and loss does. However, if neither the analyst, in this case the epidemiologist, nor the management, in this case the politicians, have to bear the cost of being wrong, there is reduced incentive toward due diligence or precision. 4. Part of this crisis seems to be the confusion between a model and the object, person, or process that it purports to represent. And this was represented in the surrealist René Magritte's piece called The Treachery of Images, which depicts a pipe with the words, "This is not a pipe," written in French underneath it. The painting visually represents the idea that a model or representation is not the same thing as that which it represents. So for instance, typically I have no problem ascribing altruism to politicians or omniscience to experts, as say a first model of how I should behave around them, because I do not typically have to act on their declarations. This is similar to the fact that I presume every stranger I meet is honest for the purposes of mere conversation. However, if I meet someone at a bar who claims to be a brain surgeon, and that's a model of their competence, and I need brain surgery, I will vet the competence of this person, that is to say, try to discover the reality or get a more sophisticated model, more assiduously, since I will have to bear the cost of my imprecise estimation of their competence. In the same way, I do not presume government experts to be omniscient, nor do I consider medical consensus or any other kind of consensus to be definitive. And I have 2 reasons for this, based on my experience and I would presume that of the listener. Reason A. Only 20%, and that's a made-up statistic, of the people in any given profession actually know what they're doing. I have worked in the area of predictive modeling for 7.5 years, and I've met many people. Approximately 3 to 4 of them, and that's a made-up statistic as well, know what they're doing, and the rest are merely doing what they're told. Once again, incentives present themselves. If one's only concern is the acquisition of a paycheck, then one need only follow orders and attend to the value hierarchy of one's superiors, whether or not such a hierarchy has an ontic referent external to one's superiors. Indeed, why would one concern oneself with concerns external to such a context? The listener would do well to consider one's own experience. How many with whom you have worked are truly competent, and how many are merely more concerned with the sating of superiors than anything else? This is another reason to doubt the accuracy of the models, and that's not a slight against the epidemiologist. However, there are few who can be both statistically and epidemiologically competent. Reason B, there must be a consideration of one's model of consensus if one is to make substantive decisions based upon it. Consensus, in my experience, in matters both actuarial and data scientific, is not made through a majority meeting of practitioners who exhaustively examine and interrogate the evidence and decide on the veracity of some set of statements. In practice, a few people write a paper, hardly comprehensive in its scope, there is a mild examination of it, and then nearly everyone goes along with it, since few want to explain to their boss why they are going against published standards. Upon request, I can provide examples from both actuarial and data science disciplines. In general, one can observe when due diligence has not taken place by how much debate there is on technique and how much people rely on judgment. The articulation and measurement of knowledge is typically inversely proportional to a practitioner's reliance on judgment. Once again, the reader would do well to consider one's own experience. How has consensus been reached in one's own context? Has it been through exhaustive examination of evidence, or the ceding of responsibility to one of the louder voices in the room? Now, a rejoinder to the above would be to inquire why I am not responding to the incentives listed above. Do I consider myself a moral paragon? Certainly not. The listener's best bet is to presume I am entirely selfish. It is simply the case that my self-interest extends beyond the stage one thinking of paycheck receipt. Frankly, much of what drives me is the terror that if one does not attend to the details of any one discipline, then it will not be long before that discipline collapses. It is certainly the case that I'm responding to my own incentives. I merely have a longer time horizon than some. Reason 5. A difficulty of these events, only tangentially related to incentives, is the difficulty in the estimation of the death rate. Preferably, one would wish to estimate the death rate while controlling for variables considered to be epidemiologically salient. For example, metrics related to the healthcare industry, population density, cultural metrics of diet and cleanliness, and other pure guesses on my part, since I am not an epidemiologist. However, the first task would be an estimate of the death rate without controlling for anything. And ideally, this would be accomplished by randomly selecting 100,000 people, made up number, testing them, and following those infected until they were dead or had survived. One would then estimate the death rate as the total dead divided by the total infected. However, this is not how it has proceeded. In general, if one only tests those who are possibly presenting symptoms, then one is strongly biasing one's sample. In particular, presumably, since I'm not an epidemiologist, if one is already presenting symptoms, then the virus is already having a deleterious impact on one's health, because otherwise one wouldn't go to the doctor. This will lead to an overestimation of the death rate. One will estimate the death rate as the number dead divided by the number infected and experiencing negative effects. This is roughly akin to issuing a fidelity survey to subscribers of a pornographic magazine and finding out that 90% of those subscribers of the magazine had cheated on their spouses. We are biasing our sample statistics. And so then here's the conclusion. Given that people have behaved exactly as one would expect in any situation, I am unable to distinguish between this and any other situation. Hence, I am not concerned with the threat of COVID-19. So now the question becomes, as should always be the question, how then shall we live? How do we estimate ordinate action? And to this end, strap in for some massive Monday morning quarterbacking. 1. I think it is useful to note that what one takes as one's incumbent or baseline situation is important. My starting point is that one is lucky if one does not die in poverty and pain. My reason for this is that it appears to be the lot of man for nearly all time. Man's natural state is one of poverty and nakedness. There may be a temptation to forget this amidst our momentary opulence, but no Russian peasant 200 years ago, for instance, would suppose that they would be safe from anything, viral or otherwise. If one views danger as a baseline situation, then this whole COVID-19 business is not startling. It is one more thing trying to kill us, and it can get in line with all of the rest. However, if one presumes safety is the natural state of things, then all of this can seem quite harrowing. Moreover, it creates an incentive on the part of the politician to present a vision of a restoration of the paradisal state if only they exercised greater power. My view is that such a paradisal state is illusory. 2. The true difficulty of the present time is that knowledge is expensive. Again, I am not an epidemiologist. Hence, for me, the cost of epidemiological knowledge is expensive. However, epidemiologists are not me, and they are quite unaware of my value hierarchy and my constraints. And the same is true for the listener. It would be very expensive, in fact, for them to get all of the information that I know and that the listener knows. The fact of the matter is that safety from COVID-19 is not binary. One can be more or less safe. Moreover, it is also not the case that being safer is a categorical good. For instance, even if one survives COVID-19, there is no guarantee that one will not have an equally harrowing death, nor that the intermediate years will not be filled with sorrow. Hence, how many resources ought one to devote to its amelioration? As an illustration, consider making one's home safer. One can deadbolt one's door, and one can purchase a security system. One can put bars on one's windows. However, by the time one is digging one's moat, one's family may be starving, since one has spent all of one's money on security. One typically holds many values at once, with different resource allocations for each of them. Any incremental increase in one of these allocations would produce a decrease in another. What should have happened is that the experts would have made their costly knowledge free to the public. The public would then weigh that knowledge with their own knowledge, the acquisition of which would be costly to experts, and make decisions accordingly. People and businesses would change their behavior as they saw fit with respect to their value hierarchies. Much of what has happened would probably still happen. People would look out for their elderly family members. Nursing homes would tighten access. The public does not need the government to tell them to do it. As it turns out, the public has an incentive to not have their family die. Businesses have an incentive to not be known as places of squalor. However, the public, after having the knowledge of the experts given to them, can do this more efficiently because the public has a large amount of knowledge which the experts do not have, even though they have great expertise in their particular fields of study. Instead, the government declared safety from COVID-19 to be a categorical good to be pursued at any price. The fact of the matter is that death and poverty will result from the retardation of the production of goods and services and the inflation of the money supply. However, this will be spread through time and not attributed to any given politician. For another example, consider all of the traffic fatalities which occur. These may be greatly reduced through the reduction of speed limits. For example, if speed limits were reduced to 10 miles per hour, there would be far fewer fatalities and injuries. However, what would be the cost? Far fewer goods and services would be produced. How much more scarcity would occur due to trucks not being able to deliver goods quickly? How many more would die or live impoverished lives as a result? How much less work would be done since people could not travel as far from their houses? The reduction of traffic fatalities, however laudable, is not a categorical good. It is one good among many for which everyone chooses to contribute more or fewer of their resources, which could be used to work toward other goods. And the above also highlights the problem of declaring what are essential businesses. Aside from the political problem of the state governments picking winners and losers, it is by no means clear what businesses are essential, and that state governments have that knowledge. Does one truly believe that shutting down non-essential businesses will not have an impact on essential businesses? Is it the case that the supply chain of any essential business is exclusively other essential businesses? Is one to believe that the state government is able to select essential businesses in such a way so that all supply chains of essential businesses are also essential? Such knowledge is short only of omniscience. Finally, one must consider the costs which are harder to measure. For instance, what is the social cost incurred by encouraging the public to view everyone else as a potential threat? What is the cost of discouraging touch, which can often be one of the most meaningful methods of interaction, as any parent knows? 3. For Christians, I think we need to be clearer about what is meant by authority. How long will Christians hide behind Romans 13? Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, with the Acts 5, we must obey God rather than men, escape hatch. If Christians are negligent in the construction of a more sophisticated reading of Romans 13, they will find themselves in Acts 5 situations with increasing frequency. A concept I find useful and related to the above is that authority is derived from demonstrable competence. Although I have no way of testing it, I extend it to experts. For instance, Anthony Fauci. I extend to him the courtesy of a belief in competence in his purported field of expertise. I conjecture he knows far more than I do about such matters. Hence he is an authority in my life with respect to epidemiology. However, he is not an authority in my life in any other matter. In a similar manner, if anyone, politician or otherwise, claims they are an authority, they must be prepared to demonstrate their competence. If they do not, I dismiss them categorically. 4. I find the narrative of needing to trust scientists as guides for how we are to conduct ourselves as absurd. What is shockingly entertaining is that while being done in the name of science, this looks exactly like religion. A sacred caste, for instance, priests or scientists, has proclaimed an invisible threat, God's wrath, COVID-19, will cause mass destruction unless the public performs certain actions, religious rites, or social distancing. Is it science, or is it science with a capital S? And are they scientists, or are they scientists with a capital S? Despite statements concerning the decline of ecclesiastical affiliation, the religious impulse seems difficult to extinguish. Although I am a Christian, I am always wary of unexamined religious conviction and recommend that the listener be so as well. One should never fear to question self-proclaimed authorities and interrogate them, their data collection, their analysis, their assumptions, and their incentives. 5. With the public's consent, politicians have been able to drive the public into their homes and have production grind to a halt. Are we going to cower every time an expert, who does not have to bear any immediate cost of being wrong, says there is an invisible killer? At least in the event of foreign invasion, there is a clear corporeal threat to which the government can point. My only surprise in all of this was how quickly people ceded their freedom. Why would the government not have the incentive to do this again for any other stated threat? The public will only be subject to the tyranny of experts if it chooses to be. The real question each of us has to answer is whether the public is sufficient for the responsibility of freedom. Is the public, with all information available, including the expensive, specialized knowledge made available by experts, better able to balance the trade-offs while attending to its value structures, or is this done better by the government? If one supposes the latter, one must first explain what is inherent in the nature of government, that it would be extensively populated with people infinitely more knowledgeable, articulate, and efficient than the public or any business in which the listener has worked. Does the public need to be told what is good by the government? Is the public so inept so as to need the guidance of politicians? If that's the case, then why did the public elect those politicians in the first place? Is it the case that the public is competent on legislative, judicial, and economic matters on voting day, but otherwise inept the rest of the time? The triumph of free market economics over planned economies seems to indicate otherwise. I believe that the correct course of action is, as it always has been, to take responsibility for one's actions. And to this end, I recommend the following. A. Be very clear with people with whom you're interacting how you have been conducting yourself, and inquire of them as to how the parties should interact. That is, should they hug, shake hands, or smile at each other 6 feet away? B. Those of us who have jobs which have been deemed essential should consider ourselves fortunate and, if we can, start setting aside money to help others. In particular, the retardation of the production of goods and services combined with an inflation in the supply of money is going to cause large inflation. Hence, the buying power of all people, especially those who have lost work, will be greatly reduced. If we do not prepare now to be helpful in the future, it will only incentivize the seizure of additional power by the government. The potential silver lining of this is that the more we individually take responsibility for ourselves and our community, the more we will gain the ground ceded to the government in the past, particularly in the name of charity, and the less call there will be for government intervention. C. Since the value of the dollar is going to be reduced, one should invest in capital now, and this will aid in the above. At this point, I should also mention that I have zero formal training in matters of financial, what's the right word? Not analysis, but say recommendation, advisement. So don't really take that part seriously, but it is how I'm going to behave. D. Let any petty tyrant know that you will do what you can to see they are deposed through voting against them in primaries or other means. They must be made to know the cost of their actions. 5. Or rather E, re-examine your beliefs. The fact of the matter is that one cannot find succor in political mandates. Safety cannot be summoned, nor fear be made to take flight through legislation. We should be grateful that we had any illusion of safety. It is a testament to the hard work of our forefathers that nature has been tamed as much as it has. However, it should be observed that no matter what is legislated, each of our lives will contain sorrow, suffering, and death. One ought to think about how one will attend to those realities. I have found the message of Christianity to be the most logically consistent, empirically adequate, and experientially relevant message. I encourage the reader to examine the book of John and the person and life of Jesus Christ. And if the reader, or rather the listener, would like to discuss this any further, I would welcome it. Ronald James Padova observed that the lover of life is not a sinner. So do not be safe. Live.